The Promised Neverland was a show that captivated anime fans all around the world. Its dark, enthralling plot, well-written characters, and beautiful art style truly established it as one of the best horror anime to date. But what was originally set to become a very strong show ended up being one of the most hated anime adaptations of all time. Let's talk about it. The story begins at an orphanage known as Gracefield House, where we meet our main three characters, Emma, Ray, and Norman, along with a group of other children. We're also introduced to Isabella, the mama, who oversees the entire orphanage. However, you quickly notice that something about this place is rather off. We learn that all the kids have numbers printed on their necks and are required to take odd IQ and ability tests every day. More on this later. At the end of episode 1, we see one of the kids, Connie, who is supposedly being adopted. However, after she leaves, Emma discovers that Connie forgot to bring her toy, so she and Norman set out to return it to her. In doing so, they find her dead body with the Vida, or life flower, sticking out of her chest. Long story short, they weren't actually living in an orphanage, but instead at a human farm, designed to produce meat for demons to eat. And remember those tests I mentioned earlier? Well, they're used to grade the quality of each person. Pretty messed up. The rest of season 1 is essentially about Emma, Ray, and Norman plotting their escape from the farm and trying to figure out how they can save as many of the other children as possible. Eventually, they manage to do so, but not before Norman could be sent off. I feel like throughout anime, building suspense and tension is especially difficult. However, in my opinion, The Promised Neverland manages to do this very effectively. With the looming presence of Isabella, who always seemed to know exactly what the kids were doing at every turn, you were made to feel like she would just appear out of absolutely nowhere and completely ruin all their plans. Season 1 also nailed its character development. Emma, Ray, and Norman weren't just clever kids, they had depth. Emma's moral compass and athletic capability, Norman's strategic mind and ability to always find the right answer, Ray's inner conflict between helping his friends, or Isabella, who turned out to be his biological mother. It was all done in a way that almost forced you to care about them. And this, coupled with the slower pacing of the season, allowed moments that could have just been brushed past to carry a much deeper emotional weight. The season also teased us with glimpses of a much larger, far more dangerous world outside of Gracefield House. The tracking devices, the mentioning of other farms, it all hinted at a much bigger story that left you dying to know more. And naturally, fans were very excited to see what season 2 would have to offer, especially when the manga was talked about so highly. However, what we would be given later on would go down as one of the biggest fumbles in anime history. Just for some context, season 1 scored an 8.49 rating on my anime list, whereas season 2 only scored a 5.26 with over 1 million fewer ratings. It seemed as though everyone was dropping the show, but why? Well, let's start with the most obvious problem: the pacing. Season 2 felt rushed from beginning to end. Whole arcs from the manga were skipped and major plot developments were crammed into just a few episodes. Take the Goldie Pond arc, for example. This arc was one of the most intense, action-packed parts of the manga, and it would have added a ton of depth to Emma's character and given us so much insight into the outside world. But they just took it out. And the pacing wasn't just bad, it was almost incoherent. Time skips were happening left and right with little explanation or acknowledgement. It was almost like the writers forgot that they had absolutely cooked with the first season and decided to just strip everything they had built back to square one and adopt a new approach. It was very here's a question, here's an answer, sometimes with little to no exploration. The escape from Gracefield House in season 1 was a calculated, carefully crafted plan, but in season 2 everything felt haphazard and rushed. Remember how the first season actually spent time creating complex layered characters? Well, in season 2 that was also thrown out the window. Emma becomes this overly optimistic fairyland hero who seems to have an answer to everything, but there was never any reason as to why she came to be this way. It was like they were trying to compensate for the lack of Norman. Ray's internal struggles were pretty much sidelined, and don't actually get me started on how they handled the whole Norman situation. It was actually so bad. Isabella, who was one of the best antagonists I had seen in anime at the time, was just neglected. They whacked her in a jail cell and pretty much called it a day there. And of course, this couldn't be the downfall of the Promised Neverland video if I didn't touch on the anime original ending. And perhaps I could give it slightly more credit than I'm going to give it, but after just how good season 1 was, maybe I'm slightly biased. There were so many ways that they could have ended the show. Hell, making it back into the human world should have been a satisfactory way for it to conclude. But it was more about the means of how they actually took it there. I mean, for example, the main weapons the kids were using throughout the season were more traditional weapons such as bow and arrows or knives. And then all of a sudden they all just whipped out guns? Like, it just came from nowhere. Season 2 could have been the deep dive into this rich world that we were all invested into learning about, but unfortunately, it barely scratched the surface. Could the show have been saved with another couple seasons or just a better adaptation? Probably, considering how good the manga was. But what we got instead was a perfect example of wasted potential, and as fans, we can only imagine what could have been. The Promised Neverland Season 2 showed us exactly how to ruin an anime.